Hi, let's talk about something interesting today. Countless influential thinkers from history held shockingly misguided moral beliefs or engaged in morally reprehensible behavior. It's pretty wild when you look back. Aristotle once believed that women were essentially imperfect men and even argued that some folks were naturally meant to be slaves. Descartes had some pretty disturbing thoughts about animals that they would make you cringe. Hume and Kant, yup, they were guilty of harboring racist ideas. Hegel didn't hold back when it came to demeaning Africans, neither did Ibn Khaldun or many others. Well, Nietzsche, well, he had a real disdain for sick folks. Mills didn't see any problem with colonialism. Fanon wasn't exactly a champion of LGBTQ plus rights either. And oh, Fudge, yeah, he had some serious anti Semitic leanings. Heidegger, yeah, he was an actual Nazi sympathizer. Schopenhauer, quite the sexist he was. Rousseau, he up and abandoned his own kids. Wittgenstein, well, can you believe he actually physically punished his youngest students? Thomas Jefferson, political leaders, they're numerous, and that's only the Western society. And guess what? There are plenty more from almost every society: China, India, Muslim societies, everywhere. So it's a real eye opener when you dig into the history of these influential thinkers. Prominent thinkers, flag bearers, despite their intellectual achievements, often reveal significant moral or intellectual shortcomings. Some of their ideas turned out to be false, unjustified, and potentially harmful. So today let's discuss how should we handle these brilliant yet flawed figures from the past. Interesting question. This question doesn't come with easy answers, but I thought it's worth exploring. So the insights we gather here might also apply to dealing with imperfect contemporary thinkers, scholars in various disciplines, and leaders and people in general. You should also consider how these concerns translate to addressing the misdeeds and claims of leaders in other fields, both past and present. Here's the deal: when someone is wrongdoing or their wrongdoing has no direct connection to their area of expertise, it's usually less of a concern, right? However, when senior leaders, for example, produce data related to social issues while behaving in ways that worsen those issues or privately demean those affected by them, it's a more complicated matter. Moral dimensions often come into play as these leaders may have moral motivations behind their factual knowledge, reeking of duplicity. So in such cases, their flaws parallel those of the thinkers I just discussed or we're talking about here. It's a tangled web, but it's an important one to untangle. So let's see what are some of the key concerns here. People versus ideas. We've got a dilemma here. Do we focus more on the thinker or their writings, their sayings, their ideas? Well, it's tempting to ignore the person behind the work, but if Nietzsche is onto something and philosophy is like an author's life story, maybe we shouldn't be so quick to separate the two. Then the second concern is ad hominem issues. Sometimes our response to flawed thinkers can seem like personal attacks rather than critiques of their ideas. So ad hominem attacks are usually frowned upon, but are there situations where they might actually be justified? Like if someone who loudly condemns shoplifting gets caught shoplifting, does that make shoplifting okay? It's a tricky balancing act. And also, does the thinker's moral character influences their moral or non-moral ideology? That's worth pondering. Gandhi found involved in a violent act, for example. And the third part is major versus minor issues. Thinkers are mainly remembered for their big ideas, but sometimes their flaws are lurking in the smaller stuff. What makes an idea major or minor? Is it about how much, how good, or how influential it is? Or does it depend on who is judging and maybe even some moral evaluation? It's a bit subjective, isn't it? Then the fourth concern is fixing the past. We have seen statues being pulled down, history being revised or revisited, and sometimes ideas are also built on shaky ground like false info. If these thinkers had better facts, would their ideas have been better too? Subjective. And the fifth concern is, can they make amends? You see, while living folks can apologize and try to make things right, what about these flawed, deceased thinkers? Can they somehow make up for their past views, especially if they later had a change of heart? There is plenty more to consider, but these are some big picture thoughts to chew on. Now, let's say how we respond to this. The first approach is embrace the good, ignore the bad, which is a way to handle this in a manner that we recognize that everyone, including historical thinkers, has their fair share of flaws. So we can focus on the interesting and valuable parts of their work, especially if their bad ideas or actions don't directly relate to their writings or their thoughts. For example, consider if there's a link between Frege's anti-Semitism and his work in logic. If not, then maybe we can study and use his logical insights without moral objection. And here is the catch. We often don't know much about a thinker's personal life and struggles, which might explain their flaws, even if it doesn't excuse them. If we choose to ignore the bad stuff without making it clear to others, we risk giving the impression that these thinkers were flawless paragons of virtue when they certainly weren't. However, if we just sweep the bad under the rug and focus only on the good parts of a thinker's work, we might end up distorting their actual work, especially if the thinker believed their bad ideas were crucial. For instance, Kant's racist views were deeply embedded in some of his work. By sanitizing it, we risk misrepresenting not only Kant's ideas but also the history itself. So while take the good, ignore the bad has its merits, there are limits. We need to consider our own flaws and the flaws of others and what crosses the line into being too serious to ignore. It's a fine line to walk for sure. Another approach could be we just slam the door on these thinkers. No more reading, researching, or teaching their stuff. So we are talking about a full-blown boycott. But hold on, we can't really erase them completely. Some folks will still dig their work despite the flaws, so they will linger in memory as they used to be in the canon thinkers. For scientific thinkers, we can't obliterate their work and maintain the continuity or evolution of thought. So zero tolerance policies sometimes fly for today's troublemakers, like we won't watch their movies ever again, and maybe that has some merit. The big question though is, what's the point? Punishing dead thinkers like this is mostly symbolic, but it does send a message we won't tolerate prejudice. Habermas had a similar thought when dealing with Germany's historians' debate. He believed that preserving the memory of past atrocities is crucial to respecting the dignity of oppressed people. Still, excommunicating these thinkers might be too harsh. We would lose their insights and their legacy could go up in smoke. There's also a tricky theoretical debate about whether dead folks can actually be harmed or wronged. Plus, it leaves a gap in the history of thought, as I said. I talked about science, but like reading an incomplete and sanitized version of history is similarly complete lack of knowledge. So that makes it more likely we would forget the offenses and messes up our own understanding of later thinkers influenced by these flawed folks. It's kind of like whitewashing US history by ignoring the not so pretty parts like slavery, segregation, and the genocide of Native Americans. Remember, we are talking about thinkers who have got some good stuff going for them, who have made a overall positive influence and left a positive heritage for humanity. They are famous for a reason. But if someone is a total dud with nothing but bad and wrong ideas, it's a fair game to give them the boot. The problem is, they might leave us with very few thinkers to work with. Now, here is another take. It might not be fair to judge historical thinkers by today's standards, and that's a very valid point. After all, they couldn't predict what future generations would consider totally unacceptable. So, up to 300 years ago, virtue was to treat slaves well, not abolition. It evolved over a period of time. Or think about it this way, even today, folks who are progressive about one issue might not be so enlightened about others. How many people have we educated about homosexuality even in Western world over the last 2 decades? So it's like we have got this blind spot and we all do it to some extent. I'm not calling anyone out here, it's just human nature. And in that sense, we are a bit like those thinkers we are dissecting in this discussion, right? Aren't we? So, maybe we should cut them some slack, at least to some degree. Perhaps they weren't really to blame for their views. Given the norms of their time, they might have genuinely not known any better. But here is the catch. This forgiveness thing only flies if these flawed thinkers genuinely didn't know better. Take Kant, for instance. He knew, a man of his intelligence, that travel reports were sketchy sources, but he still relied on them. Even then, some might argue they should have known better. After all, thinkers are all about critical thinking and questioning assumptions, right? Shouldn't they apply that to their own lives? And here is another twist. Maybe we shouldn't hold professional ethicists like priests to the same standards as regular folks. It's a whole new level of scrutiny when you are studying ethics for a living. And not only studying, preaching, selling. Alright, here is another angle. Instead of brushing the bad stuff under the rug, let's put it out in the open. We acknowledge both the good and the bad in a thinker's work, and we use the good parts to diagnose and fix the bad. Hiding the bad is just plain wrong. It can mislead people who don't know how much about that thinker, making them think they were some kind of saint when they were often far from it. Maybe if these thinkers had seen how their good and bad ideas clashed, they would have ditched the bad stuff for the good. Picture this: Kant using his categorical imperative to kick his racist beliefs to the curb, or Mill using his principle of utility to trash his support for colonialism, right? But who knows? They might have stuck to their guns on the bad stuff. Now, if the good and bad ideas in a thinker's work are connected, like they have logical ties, they could be in conflict. By diving into how these thinkers try to square that circle, we might learn something useful. For instance, when a group dehumanizes another, there's a clash between what they claim to believe, like respecting all people, and what they want to do, like enslave or wipe out a minority. Sometimes they resolve this conflict by denying the humanity of the oppressed, like saying they are less than human. And we see that going on in today's world, othering people, dehumanizing them by through giving them a group identity and making it despicable. But honestly, when it belongs to the past, we're just speculating here. We don't really know how these thinkers would have reacted to criticism they never faced. Aristotle may have changed his position on slavery, for example. But here's the problem, though. Not all thinkers have redeeming qualities in their work. So this redemption plan doesn't work for everyone. And there's a cost to it too. When we are busy redeeming the big names, we might miss out on lesser known thinkers, especially those from minority backgrounds who have ideas just as good or maybe even better. So redemption isn't a one size fits all solution. It's a bit of a mixed bag. So let's wrap it up. When we are dealing with these big shot thinkers from back in the day who had some pretty messed up beliefs or actions, it's not a straightforward game. We have looked at different ways to respond, like accepting the good stuff while admitting the bad or just shutting them out entirely. We've also talked about giving them a break by considering the times they lived in and how we might redeem their ideas. But here is the deal. Whichever way you swing, you've got to do your homework. You need to really understand what these thinkers were all about, both in their lives and their ideas. And don't forget about the ethics part. That is crucial too. In the end, my dears, there's no one size fits all answer here. It's a tricky issue and it's not going away anytime soon. If only thing, it'll accentuate as our standards of human rights in viewing things and justice change. So as we keep wrestling with the legacy of these historical figures and their ideas, we'll have to keep finding our own path through this moral maze. Right? On that note, I'll take your leave. Thank you very much. See you next time.